Thank you all for being here. My name's Samina Hamidi, and I'm just going to give a brief overview of not just historical and contemporary rise of anti-Asian hate in the U.S., but just, I think, the concepts that we need to be focusing on given our experiences, especially in the last 1.5 years. Okay. I think this is a great image that represents all of our Asian communities, even here, coming together for the same purpose. And we'll go to the next slide. Okay. I'm going to just provide some working definitions for 4 terms we see throughout media, but it's not always accurately depicted, and sometimes we ourselves get confused depending on, you know, our limited language or intergenerational backgrounds. Okay, so we'll start with racism. Oh. I'll give the definitions after, but one common thread throughout this presentation is going to be this concept of citizenship. And I did want to open up to the audience of how do you view citizenship and how has it approached you or your family members? And whoever would like to briefly just kind of provide feedback, that would be great, because then that gives an image of what different definitions we're working with. Yes, please.
Thank you. So what citizenship means to me?
Correct.
Hi, again, my name is Efrain. I this one's especially close to my heart because citizenship has been a word that's been throughout my life. I'm actually undocumented, so citizenship to me has been a word that has caused a lot of strain and obstacles. So that's basically what whenever I hear citizenship, I'm like obstacles and barriers and things that stop me from doing things that otherwise I would be able to do. So that's what that means to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Does anyone else? Please. Okay, yeah, I can put my mask back on. I'll just pass it.
The problem. I will go from back of you. Thank you. No, you're fine. Thank you. Do I need to turn around you or? Again, my name is Padam. In my opinion, the citizenship is huge analytics, huge discrimination definition in there. But what I understand, the citizenship is whatever you have the power, authority to being the public. Whatever you have, like government give the authorities, government give the privilege, government has all the benefit facilities, you are able to get that facilities. That is, you are the citizenship of that nation. For example, when I was in Nepal, I could vote to the politics, I could vote to the government. I have a right to have the land. I have a feelings of the I'm the Nepalese and I'm of this a person of the public of this country, so I have a right. Everybody, whoever has the same right. So that's the feeling of the citizenship, I would say. Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, so citizenship, that notion and concept does range from place to place, nation to nation. Historically, it's not always worked for excluded communities in the United States. When you go to, the Webster Dictionary, it just says, oh, you have responsible membership to your community. I'm going to actually read you something that's on a major public university's website. They have a Center for the Study of Citizenship at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. According to their site, a citizen is a participatory member of a political community. Citizenship is gained by meeting the legal requirements of a national, state, or local government, and a nation grants certain rights and privileges to its citizens. In return, citizens are expected to obey their country's laws and defend it against its enemies. We can all hear how problematic this definition is, right? And on so many levels. But we'll start with the definitions. So racism, and I only included two types, that's both individual and systemic. It refers not only to social attitudes towards non-dominant ethnic and racial groups, but also to social structures and actions which oppress, exclude, limit, and discriminate against such individuals and groups. Racist social attitudes originate in and rationalize discriminatory treatment. In the larger society, it can be seen in discriminatory laws, residential segregation, poor health care, inferior education, unequal economic opportunity, and the exclusion distortion of the perspectives of non-dominant. And this is from a Canadian anti-racist education group, but for us it would be in dominant North American cultural institutions. It also refers to a system which one group of people exercises power, and we have to emphasize power. I know we hear this term all the time, but oftentimes we're not reading that in the newspaper and the television, but if you're not in a position of power, you're not making the laws and the rules. So over another, on the basis of skin color, an implicit or explicit set of beliefs, erroneous assumptions, and actions based on an ideology of the inherent superiority of one's racial group over another, and evident in organizational or institutional structures and programs, as well as individual thought or behavior patterns. So individual is the beliefs, attitudes, and actions of individuals that support or perpetuate racism. Individual racism can occur at both a conscious or unconscious level and can be both active and passive. Examples include telling a racist joke, using a racial epithet, or believing in the inherent superiority of whites. It's learned from broader socioeconomic histories and processes and is supported and reinforced by systemic racism. Because we live in such a culture of individualism, which the U.S. really prides itself on, and we come from a very collective-based, all of our cultures do. And with the privilege of freedom of speech, some people argue that their statements, ideas are not racist because they are just personal opinion. Here, it's important to point out how individualism functions to erase hierarchies of power and to connect unrecognized personal ideologies to larger racial or systemic ones. That is, individualism can be used as a defensive reaction, and this is why it's crucial to understand systemic racism and how it operates. Systemic, also known as institutional racism, it consists of policies and practices entrenched in established institutions that result in the exclusion or advancement of specific groups of people. It manifests itself in two ways. One, institutional racism, and that discrimination derives from individuals carrying out the dictates of others who are prejudiced or of a prejudiced society, and structural, where inequalities are rooted in the system-wide operation of a society that excludes substantial numbers of members of particular groups from significant participation in major social institutions. And, you know, again, the media uses discrimination and racism interchangeably, but there are three types of discrimination. We have overt, unequal, and systemic. And it's the denial of equal treatment and opportunity to individuals or groups because of personal characteristics and membership in specific groups with respect to education, accommodation, healthcare, employment, access to services, goods, and facilities. This behavior results from distinguishing people on that basis without regard to individual merit, resulting in unequal outcomes for persons who are perceived as different. Differential treatment that may occur on the basis of any of the protected grounds enumerated in human rights laws. Overt is the granting or denying of certain rights to certain groups of individuals. Unequal is the differential treatment of one group in comparison with another because of certain characteristics. And the example here is paying lower wages to women in comparison to men for work. Systemic is the policies and practices we just discussed in the previous slide. Xenophobia refers to the attitudes, prejudices, and behavior that reject, exclude, and often vilify persons based on the perception that they are outsiders or foreigners to the community, society, or national identity. And in other words, it's a fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners or anything that is, quote, strange or foreign. Thanks. This one was a really important definition for me because I think a lot of us are still experiencing it. Previous generations have, and based on all of the things our communities have been facing, I think it's generations to come are going to be dealing with this baggage of intergenerational trauma. So it's historic and contemporary trauma that has compounded over time and been passed from one generation to the next. The negative effects can impact individuals, families, communities, and entire populations, resulting in a legacy of physical, psychological, and economic disparities that persist across generations. Okay, so we're going to briefly, we did citizenship. I'm going to go over, and I won't read every single point, but a timeline of anti-Asian laws, and then we'll discuss three very well-known and prevalent ones, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment Muslim ban. We'll talk about a couple of examples in anti-Asian hate, and then what our responsibilities are as a community and how we ought to be sharing stories. You guys can just briefly read this, but laws were passed as early as 1790 against Asians and then Asian Americans eventually. And just if we go down, I mean, something as simple as you are not, a Chinese person was not allowed, a law was passed in 1863, to give testimony in any cases involving a white person. I did not know that in grade school or high school even. And we can go to the next slide. What else? Let's see. We know that there was laws 1886 where, oh yes, well, I'll get into the Chinese Exclusion Act, but in 1886, the Washington Territory passes the Alien Land Law, which barred Asians from owning land. And we know, in addition to railroads and laundry, which is actually an American created, Chinese laundries were American created, right? But also agriculture on the West Coast, especially in California, they couldn't own the land that they were working because of laws like this. Next slide. What else? Okay, 1922, as late as 1920, the Cable Act. Previously, any woman who was a U.S. citizen and married a non-citizen would lose her citizenship. The Cable Act undid this piece of political, patriarchal, excuse me, I didn't edit that part, BS, unless the woman married an Asian immigrant. Marrying an Asian male would still cost a woman her U.S. citizenship. Also this year, Ozawa versus U.S. decreed that even with light skin complexion, Japanese were barred from becoming U.S. citizens. Okay, next slide. Okay, 1952. Immigration and Nationality Act repeals bar to immigration citizenship based on race. I'm sure Zion can tell you all about that, but that's 1952 is not very long ago. So we can go to the next one. Here's an image and this type of propaganda that was used once the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. So Chester Arthur was the president. What's significant about this particular act is it was the first law in the United States that prohibited the entry of immigrants solely on the basis of nationality and ethnicity. So we're looking at the 1800s for anti-immigration laws. So if anyone argues and says, oh, that's a recent development, that's completely inaccurate. And the thing is, it was supposed to be a 10-year moratorium, but then they extended it under different names and continued to do so with certain caveats. And then it really wasn't repealed until 1943, if you can imagine. So next slide. Now we're just going to go to the Japanese internment during 1942, 1945. We know 120,000 Japanese Americans were displaced. 2/3 of them were born in the United States. I mean, I know a lot of us know this information, but I think it's helpful to emphasize, again, this notion of citizenship and how it's ever changing and really dependent on the people in positions of power who decide whether we can get citizenship or not. Let's go back on one. Can we go back to that previous slide? One thing I did want to emphasize, how many of you knew that we had a camp here in Colorado? Maybe a lot of you did, which is, yeah, I mean, it's very close to home. And one thing I did want to mention is going back to that intergenerational trauma. I grew up in the Bay Area. I did not know until I was an adult that one of my best friend's parents, who I saw regularly and played with her at their house, were both born in the camps in Manzanar, you know, and that would explain a lot of things within their family. But that trauma also indicates loss of language, not wanting to maybe share history and memories, and how does that impact future generations? We can go to the next one. Muslim ban, while the countries in the Muslim ban of 2017 were not necessarily Asian countries, this was just a continuation of post 9/11, where a lot of South Asians and South Asian Americans really, for the first time in current history, were able to understand what that backlash and anti-Asian hate meant. Again, it visited the concept of citizenship and who qualified, who didn't, and the implications and stipulations were ever changing and at the mercy of the government, as we know. Okay, next. So I did get this from the NYPD site. It's a little older, 2020 to present, but I just wanted to show you the numbers and the increase and from different groups and how it just really jumped for us. We've all seen the images, the videos, the photos. We don't need to go into those graphic details, of the Thai elder who was, brutally murdered, as well as we know about the Atlanta shootings. We know all of these things, but what about the power of language used to describe our community members? And how do we get to decide what that narrative is instead of us reacting to it? And same, again, it didn't begin with the pandemic. How many of you know about Vincent Chin? Many of you. For those of you who don't, this was back in 1982, Detroit, Michigan. This young gentleman, Chinese American, he was actually adopted by Chinese American parents. He himself was born in China, but was raised in the United States. He was getting married and was out with his friends the night before his wedding. And Detroit, as you know, is a huge leader in automakers and auto lines. And there were two men who had just lost their job from the Chrysler plant, father and son. And they thought, that Vincent was Japanese. It shouldn't have mattered. And that the Japanese manufacturers were taking over the American companies. So they chased him and, brutally murdered him with a baseball bat. And they were not given any prison time. $3,000 fine, if you can imagine. So that was quite the outrage. So I'm trying to just illustrate the history. That's nothing new for us. And same, even in Denver, in 1990, there were 6 Japanese students. There was an exchange with a sister university in Japan, and there were some students studying here, and same thing. They were brutally attacked again with baseball bats from, I think it was 4 white men, and there was outrage because not much was done about it. Okay, we can go to the next one. So my focus here is really it's a call for our communities. You're all here. You all represent your communities. We're they're going to you, right, to learn what can we do, how can we get involved. Oftentimes we come from communities where we're told, just look down, do your job, don't rock the boat, right? And this is where silence is really hurting us and where we really need to change that. It is our job to protect our elders, our children, our community members, people we don't know. But that's the human element that I think we have to remember. And breaking some of those norms to protect valued norms, I think, is necessary. I'd like to read a poem by a poet named Timothy Yu. He wrote a book called 100 Chinese Silences, and I really liked this one because his critique and humor are both, well, I'll let you decide what you think, okay? Okay, Chinese silence number 22. The Italians are making their pasta, the French are making things French, and the Chinese cultivate their silence. They cultivate silence in every Chinatown on the persimmon of earth. Mute below the towns of Toronto, silently sweeping the streets of Singapore, clear of noisy self-expression. The Americans are in their sport utility vehicles. The Canadians are behaving reasonably, but the Chinese remain silent, maybe with a cup of tea or an opium pipe, and maybe a finger puzzle or water torture is involved. Or maybe the Chinese are playing the Chinese game of ping pong, the pock-pock of the ball against their tight-lipped mouths as their chefs dice scallions and bean curd. The Chinese are silent because it's their job for which I pay them what they got for building the railroads. Which silence it hardly seems to matter, though many have a favorite out of the 100 different kinds. The silence of the well-adjusted minority, the girlish silence of the reluctant acquiescence, the silence that by no means should be mistaken for bitterness. By now, it should go without saying that what Crocodile Dundee is to the Australian and Mel Gibson is to the Scot, so is silence to the Chinese. Just think, before I invented the 100 Chinese silences, the Chinese would have to stay indoors and gabble about civil war and revolution, or go outside and build a really loud wall. And when I say wall, I do not mean a wall of 1,000 miles that is visible from the moon. I mean a noisy wall of language that dwarfs my medieval battlements and paves the Pacific to lap California's shores with its brick-hard words. That's it. Do I have time for the? Perfect, thank you. Kind of wanted to, so that's the end, I think next. I'm sorry, previous. We have, and we can give you available resources just to really learn what's available. A lot of us have so much information and are so active in our communities, but let's keep getting people to become aware so we can empower our community members. I did want to do 2 breakout sessions for scenarios and some role playing. 5 minutes, okay, thank you. So the first one, if you can get into your groups, I'm going to briefly talk about the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. The first one is to distract. The second, I think you have the handout on your table, I believe. Yes, no? Okay, it's 5, you can remember. So distract, delegate, document, delay, and direct. If you guys want to break out and just discuss, and if you need me to repeat it, let me know. Okay. So the first scenario would be, say you're taking a walk in City Park, okay? 3 white teens walk by, and they walk by one single Asian teen. And one of them hits him on the shoulder and says, out of my way Kung Flu. How do you respond? So your group each comes up with that, and then I'll give you a second scenario after you're done with that one, and then we'll share with each other.